Once again, welcome and thanks for joining us today. We're going to be talking about HITRUST in the cloud, and it's actually perfect timing as it's National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. My name is Carolina Kirby-Lucier. I'm the Marketing Manager here at OnRamp, and I will be your moderator for today. We're going to try to keep the webinar to 45 minutes and save some time at the end for questions and answers. Feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation via the chat window, and we'll be sure to answer as many questions as possible at the end during the questions and answer portion. I'm also going to periodically ask some poll questions so that you guys can participate and so we can make the conversation as relevant as possible to you. After the webinar, I will be emailing out a copy of the presentation so that you can access it on demand and also share it with friends, coworkers, whoever you think this information would be valuable. And for those of you who are not familiar with OnRamp, the company was founded in 1994 as the first internet service provider in Texas. And today, OnRamp has evolved to be a HITRUST certified data center services company focused on high security, compliance, and hybrid hosting. Again, our topic for today is HITRUST in the cloud, and our goal is to help you leverage that certification framework and find out how you can securely deploy the cloud. After brief introductions, we will talk about what is HITRUST, how you can benefit from HITRUST. We'll cover challenges in cloud deployment, and then we will discuss how HITRUST fits into the picture and how you can deploy secure cloud infrastructure, as well as best practices for deploying and managing your cloud.
Eliminate hotspots. Support 4 times hot.
So, without further ado, I'll introduce you to your speakers today. We have 2 subject matter experts from OnRamp. Toby Owen, Vice President of Product Development, is here with us. He has nearly 20 years of experience in hosting, cloud solutions, and technology. And at OnRamp, Toby oversees the product strategy and execution of our portfolio of high security colocation, managed hosting, and private cloud products. Prior to joining OnRamp, Toby led the product and security teams at Cogeco Pier 1, Rackspace, and Wells Fargo.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
And also with us is Nicola Todov, our Head of Information Security. And Nicola has more than 18 years of experience leading infrastructure and security design, as well as operations for high-performance financial and telco services. He's in charge of OnRamp's information security strategy, our practices, and the implementation of those. Prior to joining OnRamp, Nicola held several positions at Gemalto, where he developed several new risk management programs for data centers and
The conference has been muted.
All right.
Thank you for having me today. I hope the information that we're going to present will be very useful for our audience.
Thanks, Nicola, and thanks, Toby. Before we dive in, I just wanted to set the scene for today's landscape, just to give us some context. There's clear benefits to adopting new technologies, but anytime you do so, you're opening up new potential vulnerabilities. And with that, organizations are just simply not confident in their cybersecurity posture. In fact, 85% of CEOs have said that cyber threats are the greatest threat to the growth of their organization. So that's a significant figure. And that's not too surprising considering that, there's a new data breach in the news every day, costing organizations millions of dollars. And, with large entities such as Equifax, we're all pretty shook up about, what can happen and just the stability of it all. Victims have ranged from hospital to dentist's office. No one is exempt. And, we've seen the total cost of data breaches just continue to rise. Right now they're about, nearing $4 million. So organizations just simply cannot afford these data breaches. In fact, many of them have to close doors, and those that don't close their doors face reputational damage and, of course, loss of future business opportunities. So leadership teams are really struggling to keep up. They don't have the expertise, they don't have the knowledge of cybersecurity or, just comprehensive security to protect themselves. And they've stated that, lack of expertise, security, and cost are their top challenges right now for deploying clouds and managing those clouds. So that's why we're talking about this topic here today. And I did want to ask you all, what are you most interested in learning about? Is it HITRUST and how you want to leverage HITRUST? Is it cybersecurity in general and just learning best practices? Or is it more about the cloud and deploying a secure cloud for your organization? So if you'll take a moment just to respond there. Looks like most of you want to focus on HITRUST, but also want to touch on deploying a secure cloud. So that gives us good reference. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Nicola to discuss HITRUST.
Hello again, everyone. So, as we explained, we're going to talk about HITRUST, the framework, where it is used, how it is applied, and let's start with a simple overview of that. So HITRUST was created by the Health Information Trust Alliance with the aim to ensure that information security is built in the foundation of management of health-related and personal data. As you know, we are currently operating under the framework of HIPAA, which tries from a government and legal perspective to define how health data is supposed to be protected. But HIPAA by itself does not provide sufficient details on how it should be implemented by the different organizations. And as evolution of the NIST standard 866, which tries to build a technical guidance on how the HIPAA should be applied in the organizations, the Health Information Trust Alliance took it over and built a certifiable framework based on the NIST guidelines, based on the standards like Common Security Framework, which evolved from ISO 27001, and build a framework which allows the organization to address the security of personal and health-related data and establish a certifiable framework where they can have a clear guidance and ability to certify their security controls, their policies, practices, and in general how they operate and secure the health data. HITRUST framework is applicable to a variety of organizations from different sizes, so it's not mandatory to be a big organization to certify for HITRUST or to adopt HITRUST as a framework. So it can be applicable from very small companies to very big companies, as well hosting providers or other service providers which are not directly healthcare related, but which may be involved into the value chain of managing healthcare data. Based on the fact that there is an option to certify, the organization can easily adopt this framework and actually provide guarantees to their customers that they manage this kind of sensitive data in a secure manner. So, as I mentioned, HITRUST certification or Common Security Framework evolved based on the number of standards. So originally it came out of ISO 27001, but it started to include as well frameworks like PCI, NIST Security Framework, and Risk Management Frameworks, which actually become the foundation of how HITRUST works out today. And based on those standards, there are different elements that are being required to be managed by the organization in a proper way. And that would include the security program that any company needs to establish, defining roles and responsibilities and accountability within the organization, human resource management, access control, risk management, the policies and processes that are involved, how systems are being adopted and introduced into production, business continuity, and so on. There are many, many aspects, total of 14 aspects for HITRUST, and what's important to understand why how HITRUST differs from other frameworks. It also, beyond the individual security control, it has adopted a maturity framework which enables to monitor and ensure the security over a period of time, therefore ensuring that organizations evolve in their security posture in the way they manage and secure sensitive data. So how does the certification work? There are 14 controls, and those controls are broken down into 5+ maturity groups, from non-implemented to implemented, measured, and managed. And that allows to provide a quite comprehensive monitoring and certification framework. There are about 845 requirements that may be applicable for different organizations, and each individual organization will be subject to the entire scope or subset of that scope based on the business services and the scale of data that they manage. And those categories, again, 14 categories, will cover everything from the security program to the bits and bytes of the variety of security controls which may be applicable for the specific business case. That may include logical security, physical security, or different types. Now, interestingly enough, security covers a lot of things that goes into the design of systems, goes into operation of systems, as well management of systems in case of incidents. So, for example, business continuity is an important part of this framework, and as such, we need to understand that a holistic approach to managing security is at the foundation of this certification framework. So, who can leverage HITRUST? The framework covers a lot of requirements and controls in regards to healthcare and personal identifiable data. As such, those two categories can be applicable to a variety of organizations that could be in the banking, government, healthcare, education, e-commerce, and so on. The fact that it includes controls from multiple frameworks, including PCI, makes HITRUST a very versatile and comprehensive framework that could be applicable practically to any aspects of the business services as we use them today.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting about HITRUST is that, as opposed to HIPAA by itself, it's much more comprehensive. So any business, I think there's two interesting things to talk about. One is that any business doing business in the healthcare space can look to the HITRUST framework to cover all of its business operations from a security and controls perspective. So what I mean by that is if let's say you're an application provider managing payments for a healthcare industry, not only are you subject to HIPAA requirements on how you handle patient information, but you're probably collecting credit card information, which means PCI is something you need to deal with. Depending on which state or locality you're operating in, there are state and regional regulations also. And so one thing that's helpful with the HITRUST framework is it incorporates all of those aspects so that you know if you're dealing with a HITRUST certified provider or application vendor, that not only are they compliant with the HIPAA laws and regulations, but also all the other aspects that might come to bear. The other part that I think is interesting is that because this framework is so broad, that there's benefit for companies that aren't in the healthcare space at all. Because it's based on industry best practices and standards like ISO 27001, like the NIST security framework and risk management frameworks, there's benefit to know if, for example, you're just in a financial services industry, that HITRUST also is going to cover a lot of your requirements. And so if you're looking for vendors or looking for suppliers, and they have been certified by HITRUST, you can know that not only are your HIPAA requirements covered, but also all the other important regulations.
So kind of leading into this next point of why is compliance not enough, can you guys describe also the difference between compliance and security, or the relationship between compliance and security?
So compliance and certifications are slightly different terms. In majority of cases, companies adopt to be compliant, but what it really means is that they are trying to strive to follow certain standards. In compliance, however, there is no guarantee that their policies, procedures, and so on fully address the different risk aspects associated with the business services which are subject to this kind of frameworks. So just an example, if you say that you're compliant with PCI but not certified to PCI, there is no guarantee that you are managing data in a secure way sufficiently enough for all the type of risk that could be applicable, that you manage the data both in transit, at rest, your vendors, your physical security, your practices of how changes are done in order to ensure that both availability, integrity, and confidentiality of the financial data is applicable. And that's a major difference between being compliant and being certified, is that with certified there is a third party, authorized third party, that evaluates and certifies, provides assurance that your practices from an independent view of third party indeed follow and provide the necessary security according to the frameworks to which the certification applies. One step further is what HITRUST took all this approach and they embed into the certification framework the maturity model, which I mentioned earlier, where the certification, the assurance that things are done in the right way is not taken only at the point of time, but based on the repetitive monitoring and evaluation, they guarantee that the adoption of the framework evolves over time, which means if you are going to start today and have that certification framework, next time when you get audited, they expect you to achieve more and more of the certification, or higher the certification and maturity model, in order to guarantee that your security posture evolves over time and you'll provide better service and better security in order to ensure that things are done in the right way.
So how would that differ from things like just being HIPAA compliant?
So interestingly enough, HIPAA compliance or HIPAA does not provide certification framework. As I mentioned earlier, there is a NIST special publication 866, which tries to define what kind of controls should be implemented in order to achieve level of compliance with HIPAA. But as there is no certification, as there is no independent body to validate that what you have done really works and is done in the right way, therefore there is no ability to guarantee that company really are doing the right thing, and everything becomes a matter of interpretation by the individuals who implement that. With the certification framework, there is a third party which can guarantee that the interpretation is the right way compared to the certification standards, and as such, this is what provides the extra levels of assurance that things will work for the better.
Okay. And I know, for example, like in PCI, in some cases there are third parties that will audit you, and in some cases you're allowed to self-certify, right?
You are not exactly allowed to certify it, but as other frameworks rely on the specific auditor to provide assurance, as opposite to HITRUST, it becomes a matter of dealing between the audit body and the company that is being audited to ensure that they work in the right way. Now, what is interesting with HITRUST is that you not only have the auditor, the independent auditor that validates that your compliance level, but even the auditor's results and reports are being quality assured by the HITRUST Alliance themselves, and as such, you have two levels of assurance that things are being done properly.
Okay, that's great.
Very valuable. So now let's take a moment to kind of poll you on what are your IT goals moving into 2018? We're still getting some more answers here. We'll wait just a moment. All right. So it looks like most of you are looking to improve your security posture. Of course, you know, part of that may be that you're looking to improve your compliance strategy as well, and that you want to meet some business goals through the cloud. So we're going to switch gears a little bit here and start talking about the cloud as it relates to, you know, the landscape that we've kind of set forth and how HITRUST plays a role in the cloud.
So it has become a common practice to listen on the news about security breaches. And when you listen to what kind of companies get breached, majority of those companies are one way or another processing sensitive data. So just an example, Trend Micro conducted a study in the past 10 years, and what their study found is that majority of the targets were handling sensitive data. Those were banks, those were health institutions, those were governments. What this really means is that different business services, the more sensitive data are being processed through those services, the highly likelihood of those services being a target of security attacks. What we see nowadays, for example, with the targets that happen over Europe with the healthcare industry, the financial institutions in US, and so on, there is a lot of demand, if you wish, for such data from the criminal areas, from the crime industries, that they actually will be trying to break into these kind of institutions regardless of the difficulty, regardless of the efforts that are being required to breach those kind of systems. And what we can see on the bottom part of this graph is that things like cyber espionage, trying to break into the availability of the services, trying to exploit a variety of attacks, 0 days and so on, even with tools that were at the government level of development, is becoming a common practice nowadays. What is important is that as you guys may be dealing with this kind of sensitive data, it's not if this type of attack will happen to your organization, it's when this type of attack will happen to your organization. And what will be most important to understand is that people need to be prepared. They need to be aware that things are very real nowadays. And don't be afraid, be prepared. And that will be the most important thing to do. Certification frameworks like HITRUST help you get prepared based on the fact that they can help you understand where you are, understand the risk associated with your business, and figure out a way to move forward by identifying the right controls for your specific needs.
Yeah, I think it's, we start talking about all of this information around security and best practices for how to evaluate your security posture in light of this new cloud era that we're now, I would say, firmly into. If you think back a little bit, for the last 10 or 20 years, enterprise computing environments were mainly dealing with servers and storage and networking that were within the four walls of your data center, right? And so there's a security model that was built around that. Those vendors may have been, you have purchased equipment from different vendors, but you were choosing based on performance, based on reliability, right? So you had a custom-built stack of hardware living in your data center that was built for the workloads you were going to run them on. Now, over the last 5-8 years, we've really seen a massive transition into the cloud. I think the majority of you on the phone mentioned that your top goal for the year is to figure out how to get more of that into the cloud. And the basic thinking doesn't change, right? That you want to decide where your applications are going to run best, and that might be continuing where they are today. It might mean that there's a different approach required to get it to work well in the cloud, or it might be tailor-made for the cloud. You might be starting a brand new project, right? And so the industry has latched onto this term as hybrid cloud, right? Which really to me is just a combination of, I can't run everything in the public cloud, but I'd like to run some of it there, right? And so there are definitely some challenges that come into that model. Number one, we've broken the time-tested security model that I have a crunchy, hardened security perimeter around my data center, and so I can trust everything that happens within it. Those days are long gone, right? We're not, even if I'm not using public cloud services in terms of infrastructure as a service, I'm probably using Salesforce. My employees are using Office 365. They've got mobile devices, and so the notion of a security perimeter needs to change. And so I think we're in the mode of learning new ways to secure a hybrid environment, and there's some significant challenges with that.
And bottom line, we can observe on a daily basis that our regulatory bodies are a step behind the attackers, and as such we have a lot of challenges to ensure that we have visibility on what's going on in our environment. And of course, it becomes up to us and our vendors to ensure that security is taken care of in the best possible way for the business services that we provide. That practically leads to a few challenges that organizations face in managing and securing their business services. That will be unclear roles and responsibilities between the companies themselves and their vendors. Lack of ability to identify the sensitive data where it is being managed or stored, which practically translates to issues with the governance and the security practices. A major challenge, and this is one of the big issues with most of the organization, is that lack of understanding of the risk universe for their business services. People are very optimistic by nature, and it's kind of difficult to teach them that bad thing can happen and can happen to them, so they need to be prepared about that. If we don't understand properly the risk associated with business services, it's very difficult to select the right controls to be applied in order to secure the systems and the data. And when we have the issues with the selection of the controls, it is becoming very difficult to ensure the three major pillars of information security, which are availability, integrity, and confidentiality, that are being achieved consistently over a period of time for the organization and the customers of the business services. What this ultimately leads us to is issues on compliance, issues of transparency and visibility on how things are being done, and ultimately higher possibility of having to deal with security-related incidents because, again, we weren't prepared in the first place.
Yeah, I think the statistic on the bottom of the slide tells a good story of the challenges that we're facing in this new cloud era or hybrid cloud era, that if half of the organizations out there legitimately don't know who all has access to their data, how others might be using it, that's a pretty significant challenge in terms of securing things, right? So obviously there's more at play than just picking the right vendor based on performance or the right infrastructure or product out there. There's a lot more to consider. So let's talk a little bit about how we might go about doing that, or maybe some of our recommendations anyways. There's obviously many different types of cloud models, and each is going to have their own set of features, functionality, security capabilities, right? And so how do you pick, right? And at the end of the day, it comes down to understanding what's the service you're providing, and how does that application or service deal with data, right? I think if you start with understanding the data that you're either collecting or managing or creating and distributing, and how that needs to be processed, you understand the value or the sensitivity of that data, you can start to think about designing an infrastructure, whether that's on-premise or all in the cloud or somewhere in between in a hybrid architecture. You're thinking about what requirements you have for your vendor rather than sitting down to a pitch about what their capabilities are and thinking, well, that sounds great, right? So I think the takeaway here is that being prepared and walking in, having a good idea of how your data maps to the controls that you have in place to understand the sensitivity of that data, right? So you'd start maybe with a risk assessment of that data. Think about how valuable is that data, what would happen to my business if I lost that data. Maybe it's customer data, maybe there's reputational risk, right? Obviously you still need to assess the basic IT requirements around what does my environment need in terms of performance, right? What are the functionalities or features? But then once you have sort of the risk equation figured out and the performance or feature requirements, then you can start to have a pretty well-defined criteria to go look at vendors, right? And not all clouds are created for the same purpose. Certainly they're not all the same. We talk a lot about cloud being proof that computing has become a commodity, but I'd say today that's definitely not the case. Maybe some of the features that vendors used to sell on might become commoditized, but certainly there are a lot of different things to consider. And so evaluating potential vendors based on what your risks are for the data as well as your performance and application capabilities gives you a much richer conversation. So let's move this now into sort of some best practices. We've broken this down into 3 areas: technology, people, and processes. And so let's dive into technology first, right? So some things to think about. What are the security technologies that you need to consider, right? Number one here is to, as you see on the bottom of the slide, really is to make sure you're taking care of the confidentiality of your data, whether that's in the cloud, whether that's in your corporate data center or somewhere in between. If that's the primary consideration, you need to obviously ensure that you've got good access controls in place, that you're storing and transmitting that data securely, which in most cases means encrypted, that you're controlling access on the perimeter, not only in terms of managing user access, but also keeping the bad guys out, things like firewall, intrusion detection, that you've got a record of who has legitimately accessed that data in terms of audit logs. Right? So there's a lot to consider here in the technology stack. But if that's really driven around a view about the confidentiality of your data, then you can really build a much more effective technology stack to help with that. I think a number one challenge that we see in this space is really around encryption. And this can be a real struggle, particularly when you're looking at cloud deployments around storage, because encryption isn't always the leading capability that gets promoted, right? Maybe you're being marketed to around price or performance or choice, right? But if you know that you've got sensitive data, you also need to make sure that you're getting your questions answered around what type of encryption capabilities do you have? What does the key management process look like for how that data is encrypted? Who's got access to that encrypted data or those encryption keys, right? Those are all good questions to start having conversations around.
And when you move from the technology to people and process, which are the other two critical elements, it becomes even more important when you're trying to select partners, as well as when you try to secure your business services in general. So let's look into the situation with people. So regardless if you do all by yourself or you get other third parties involved, it's very important to understand who will be doing what, why will those particular people will have to do one task or another, or a change, or have access to certain type of data and so on. Without understanding actually the business patterns associated with managing and operation of business services, it's very difficult to identify who's supposed to have access to your data, and how those business systems that manage this data will be affected by the human factor. As such, people play the key role in both protecting as well as threatening the business services and data that is being managed. Now, of course, people, to ensure that they do the right thing the right way, we need to have the processes established so they will be able to execute applicable tasks in a repetitive and secure manner. And as such, defining really the needs and the activities that needs to be performed by the various elements within the business service, or the people that support those business services, is a key thing. Just an example, one of the main issues in managing firewalls and availability of system is about how you manage firewall rules. Unless you have a right process, unless you have the right people to do the job, you may end up with a lot of human mistakes. You may end up with bad rules. You may end up with practically breaking the firewall as a service in a way that, despite that nobody wanted to do anything bad, you may not have a secure system simply because the right process and the right people were not involved in the right manner. This can be applied to a lot of other things, which could be take-it patching, take-it access management, and so on. And therefore, the ability to do the things in a consistent and systematic and repetitive manner from process and people point of view becomes very, very important. Ultimately, majority of frameworks require a step further to be able to trace and have visibility on activities that were done by the individual people. And therefore, this goes to the process of audit of things that were being done in order to ensure accountability and traceability. So
kind of in summary, some things to consider as you're choosing a cloud vendor. Obviously, if you're on this call, you're interested in security, not just what's the cloud. So through that lens, obviously the security capabilities of that vendor, do they have expertise in your industry? What are their guarantees and their service level agreements around availability? How quickly can you scale if you need it? Do you feel like they have an understanding of your business goals? Have they been certified? Right? I think it's one thing to claim, like Nicola explained earlier, yes, we're HIPAA compliant, but it's another thing to have a third-party audit completed and have a certification to show that you don't just have to take the vendor for their word, right? And while in the workplace, security, I would say this gently for Nicola, as an employee, right, security policies aren't always the funnest thing to discuss. If you're running a business that's dealing with sensitive data, those policies and procedures really matter, because if you're not following best practices and data gets compromised, that could mean success or failure for your business, right? So this is really important to consider, not only how you run your own business, but also who you partner with. Are they going to provide the ability to audit data access after the fact if there was a breach, so you can find what went wrong and so it can be solved, right? Are they going to partner with you in making sure that your environment is properly secured? These are really good things to talk about, and I think this list goes way beyond price and performance, right? So there's a much bigger universe here to consider. And so we'll leave you with just a bit of an introduction to a new platform that OnRamp's offering. We have rolled out our virtual private cloud platform, and we built this for a couple of reasons. One, we've been focused on companies that have sensitive data workloads for a number of years. We've seen some gaps in the market around what are the capabilities of some of these public clouds out there that aren't being addressed, that our customers have. And so we built this from the ground up to be secure, to handle secure and sensitive data workloads. The entire platform is HITRUST certified, so you don't have to just take our word for it, that things are being done properly. We built this also to help you manage your costs. Something we hear frequently from public cloud users is that, boy, I wish I knew what my bill was going to be at the end of the month. And so we've built in into the platform the ability to cap your usage. Obviously, we can, if you'd like to use more, we're happy to change that, but you've got visibility into, if I used every resource available to me, here's the most I can expect to pay for a month. That can really help with managing your budget month to month for IT costs. We've built it to be self-provisioning. So if you need resources in the next 5 minutes, you can go spin up a server, you can add storage on demand as you need them. And all of this is built on open source technology. And so you've got the ability to extend or to interact with your environment through APIs directly. We think that you should be choosing your cloud vendor based on the services and the security they offer, not necessarily the technology stack. And so obviously using open source allows you to not feel locked into a particular vendor just based on the technology stack that you're using. So there's some information at the bottom if you're interested to learn more about our virtual private cloud or anything about OnRamp. Please give us a call, send us an email. We're happy to set up a demo, walk you through the VPC product, or have discussions about any of our other capabilities. Thanks for your attendance. I think we're going to open it up for questions at this point.
Yeah, thanks so much for your insights, Toby and Nicola. I think just to kick us off, one thing that one question we get a lot is if a company is starting from scratch, they just feel overwhelmed, they see the value and the importance of all of this, but they don't have anything in place. What advice do you have for them as far as how they should start and what that might look like?
I think really a good place to start is to understand your applications, right? How are they working? What's your plan to grow those as your business grows? And then really understand where the important data is or the sensitive data in that, so that you can get focused on finding the right technology and solutions and security solutions for the most critical data in your application. Obviously, not everything needs to be fully encrypted. If your product catalog is freely available on the web, that's not something that you need to spend the extra time or money trying to figure out encryption for. But if you're collecting payment card information, obviously that's something that you do want. So I think really starting with an understanding of what your application looks like today and where you want to go with that in terms of your business growth is a great place to start.
And just to expand a little bit, security controls are not a predefined list of things that you need to do. So as Toby mentioned, the most important thing is to understand your business service, understand the type of data that you need to process, and then try to figure out the risk universe to be able, that will help you to identify and select the right level of controls. We don't want people to think that if they put a firewall, they'll be secure. If they put antivirus, they'll be secure. It does not work this way. You need to evaluate what really are the risks for your business service and your data and build security around those risks. That will manage cost, that will ensure effectiveness of the controls, and if you monitor and manage it over time, you'll evaluate if those things really work for you or if something else is needed. This is the right way to do it. This is practically the base of any security framework that you can decide to adopt today.
Yeah, and one other comment. I think there may be folks on the phone that are getting started maybe in the healthcare industry. They know how to use cloud, but all this HIPAA business is confusing, and that can be pretty daunting as well. I think a good place to start with that, honestly, is finding a partner that can help walk you through that. Don't try to get a boot camp, give yourself a boot camp from the web, but I think you really want to partner with, because there's a lot to know. Find a good partner that's going to help get you educated.
That makes sense. And we have another question here. What is the level of importance of physical access control under the HITRUST framework?
So practically all security frameworks have as a required element management of physical security. HITRUST is no different than them, and there is a full section in regards to physical control, both for people and assets, regardless where they are stored. As such, part of our certification process that we had to manage was to show to both HITRUST Alliance and our auditors that we manage the flow of people, regardless if those are internal employees, contractors, or visitors, as well as the flow of assets, that we are following certain type of best practices, when the state who is where at what given point of time, how we differentiate people, internal from visitors, how we ensure that assets are not being properly or improperly moved out from facilities and so on. So physical security is a key element in that framework. If you choose a hosting provider, it's one of the main things that you have to validate with them, because they will be the entity that will host your data and all the assets associated. So it is something that you need to be aware of and ensure that you transfer this risk of physical security to that organization, and they accept the responsibility and accountability in relationship to the physical security if they manage your data and infrastructure.
All right, thank you for that. Another question. There's a study that a large percentage of organizations that achieve compliancy with standards such as HIPAA or PCI fall out of compliancy within 3 to 6 months. What advice do you have on consistency?
Well, so I think there's an issue of staying consistent, and then there's also the issue of what is OnRamp doing to make sure that we're staying consistent. I think part of the HITRUST certification process that's really important that Nicola talked about earlier was the maturity model that's a part of that. And so saying we're HIPAA compliant is one thing. Having a certification from HITRUST means that we're agreeing to be continually audited, and that next year when we're audited to renew our certification, that not only have we maintained the practices and procedures and policies that we did the year before, but we've made advancements in terms of our maturity in dealing with those things, right? So maybe we were measuring things and now we need to be taking automatic reactions to them. Maybe we were monitoring them and now we need to be more analytical about those, right? So they're really they're looking at the maturity of the organization and consistently managing the follow-through and growth in terms of capabilities around that. So our commitment is to be in this space, dealing with sensitive data, so we can serve our customers well. And so this is our core bread and butter. In terms of what we're doing to maintain our security, and Nicola's probably going to talk about that.
Add to that, one way we're trying to ensure that people do not become complacent and overwhelmed with that is that as opposite to majority of the framework which require annual based activities and inspections and audits, we're trying to evaluate our internal process, internal activities, internal posture much more frequently, at maximum on a quarterly basis, to ensure that we do not relax on the way we deal with security, and that we're able to ensure that not only we are doing the right things over time, but we're actually improving over time as well.
Okay. Well, those are all the questions that we have so far. Is there anything else maybe that we haven't discussed, or any misconceptions that you can think of that you've received, outside of this webinar that you think would be helpful to this audience?
I mean, the most important thing that I would recommend is do not believe certification by itself is sufficient, regardless what that is. Of course, it's even worse for compliance, but ultimately that needs to be part of the culture of the organization, that needs to have executive management support and permanent commitment of moving forward, improving, and be able to move from implementing to measuring and then to managing the security and of business services. Without constant moving forward, I mean, we simply will fall and practically become a victim of the new threats that evolve on a daily basis.
Yeah, I would just add that I think there's a lot to understand here. Just trying to understand the cloud can be fairly daunting, but trying to understand how to operate applications in a secure way, dealing with sensitive data in a hybrid cloud environment can be downright overwhelming. So I guess my best advice is don't try to tackle that alone, and do make sure you've got a plan on how you're going to tackle that. Don't just assume, well, I'll figure that out later. I'm going to get going and I'll add security later, because oftentimes you've made the investment to get something running in a particular way or with a particular vendor, and it can be very difficult to retrofit that. I think you want to take the time now to figure out what your plan is, at least in the medium term, and then you can make good decisions about where you're going to run that. Maybe you need to do some evaluation of a couple of vendors, but I think planning in security from the start in the long term is going to save you a lot of effort, and you'll end up with a much better environment and outcome for your customers.
All right. Thank you so much for your participation, everyone. Hope you found some valuable information here. And as I mentioned before, I will be sending out a copy of this via email, so you'll have a link to the on-demand presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.